Hello everyone, Kibler here, and today I wanted to talk a bit more about the mean streets of Gadgetzan cards that we have seen so far. We're supposed to be getting most of the cards, perhaps all the cards revealed pretty soon, but I wanted to jump into what we saw most recently from the Jade Lotus faction, the gang. Let's start first with a sort of holdout from last week. There was the Mana Geode, which was revealed over the course of the weekend, and this is an interesting card that has gotten kind of a lot of different perspectives on it. Some people seem to think that this card is going to be totally busted. Some other people seem to think that it's just not really that high impact card at all as a priest card. And I'm kind of in the latter camp. I think that Mana Geode is kind of overrated by a lot of people. It's clearly a card that, if it gets going, can offer a ton of value and a ton of board presence for a single card. The problem is that you have to have a Mana Geode, which is a 2/3 for 2, attack a minion and survive, and then heal it before you get more than, well, just a 2/3 for 2. And I think this card suffers from a lot of the same problems as Northshire Cleric. That's a card that used to be kind of a staple in priest decks and has now kind of fallen by the wayside in a lot of priest decks, with the exception occasionally of some of the more combo-oriented stuff with Wild Pyromancer and Circle of Healing, and that doesn't really apply in quite the same way to Mana Geode. But you know, if there were a world where there were a lot of small minions, like 2/1s for 1, things like that, where Northshire Cleric used to thrive, I think Mana Geode would do really well. The problem is that there's lots of minions that trade favorably against Mana Geode, like Tunnel Trog or Alexstrasza's Champion, and also matches up really poorly against Fiery War Axe. If you think about the sort of major decks, you know, it doesn't really match up well against the minions in Shaman decks. It gets kind of outclassed pretty quickly and removed easily by Spirit Claws and by Lightning Bolt. Against Druid, there's nothing that it really attacks into and gets healed against. Against Warrior, it dies to War Axe. Against Aggressive Warrior, it dies to Alexstrasza's Champion. So it doesn't really fit anywhere in the way that the metagame is really shaped up right now. So I think that there's maybe a world where Mana Geode is powerful, especially if it has support in the form of something like Velen's Chosen, but I don't think it's a card that's going to make a big splash when it enters the format with the release of Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. Moving on to the neutral cards, let's just start with the Jade Lotus cards, the Jade Golem cards, at the top with Aya Blackpaw. Now, first of all, let's just talk a little bit about Jade Golems in general. Jade Golem is, a mechanic where when you summon a Jade Golem, the first one you summon in a game is a 1/1. The second one is a 2/2, 3/3, so on. And so this is a powerful effect when you're able to do a lot of it in an individual game, especially if you're able to start doing it early on, so you can, just keep making bigger things very quickly. With Aya Blackpaw, there's a couple of things going on here. One is you're getting multiple bodies for a single card. With the Battle Cry, you're getting often probably a 3/3, 4/4, maybe even bigger, along with the 5/3 for 6, which is not necessarily amazing in its own right, but the fact that it has the Death Rattle as well means that this is particularly strong against board wipe effects. You force your opponent to deal with the 2 bodies, and if they do something like Hellfire or Twisting Nether or whatever else, you'll end up with an additional body that comes along when Aya Blackpaw dies. So I do think that this is likely to be a staple card in any Jade Golem focused deck. As to whether those decks are going to be highly competitive, that really remains to be seen for what other support the mechanic has. Speaking of other Jade Golem support, Jade Spirit is kind of like the basic Jade Golem generating minion, and this is, in its own right, not necessarily a particularly attractive and exciting card. You're not going to look at Jade Spirit and be like, ooh, I want to build a Jade Golem deck. By itself, you're not really getting a lot of stats for the cost, but if you do have enough other things that allow you to summon Jade Golems before you play your Jade Spirit on turn 4, you could potentially get pretty significant board value for the cost. So I think this may end up being kind of a cog in the wheel of the Jade Golem mechanic, but not really any kind of standout. And it's important to note that the Jade Golem mechanic is inherently very linear, so you're often going to just want to cram as much of the Jade Golem cards as you can in a single deck, simply because the more you have, the more powerful all of them are. That's kind of the thing that I don't really necessarily like about the mechanic. I do like that it's a mechanic that will encourage people to play different cards than they normally play, in terms of just going for, the most efficient card stat-wise, or the best removal spell just cost-wise, or whatever else, because, you want to play more of the Jade Golem cards. But when the mechanic literally just makes you want to play with as much as possible, because everyone makes all the others that much more powerful, I think it's a little bit less interesting. I've seen some people comparing it to Cthulhu, and I think it's a bit different because most of the power you get from playing Cthulhu is the Cthulhu-enabled cards, the cards that get more powerful when your Cthulhu has 10 or more attack. And that's a lot different than just everything's better every time you play more things. You know, we haven't really seen successful Cthulhu decks that are just looking to make the biggest Cthulhu they can. They're usually looking to turn on Ancient Shieldbearer or Twin Emperors or whatever else, and then maybe, you know, eventually kill you with the Cthulhu, but it's mostly about enabling those synergy cards. It's not really about just piling up as big a Cthulhu as possible. And, you know, that feels a little bit different with Jade Golems because every single one of them, you know, sort of linearly becomes more powerful as you play more of them, so you really have an incentive to just jam as much as you can into a deck. So I'll be curious to see what Jade Golem decks really end up looking like if they do make a splash in competitive play, but I'm concerned that they're just super, super linear and won't necessarily have a lot of interesting deck building decisions going on. All right, moving on to the other neutral cards. These don't necessarily have quite the same obvious homes. Daring Reporter, I've heard some people talk about playing this in like mill decks because if you play Daring Reporter and then play, you know, Cold Oracle, then your opponent will draw cards, your Daring Reporter will get bigger. I don't think that's going to really be how this card sees play. In fact, I don't really think this card will see play. It could be maybe used as an answer to decks that draw a lot of cards themselves, but the real key to fatigue decks, to mill decks, is the fact that, generally speaking, they mostly ignore the basic axis of interaction in the game, which is minion combat. You know, the reason that a deck like the Mill Rogue deck with Bran and Cold Light and Gang Up and whatever else is able to be powerful is because it looks to largely make most of what your opponent's deck is trying to do not matter. And once you put Daring Reporter in it, you know, all your opponent's removal cards end up being much more powerful than if your deck was just itself a bunch of removal, healing, and ways to force your opponent to draw cards and put more cards into your deck. So I don't really think this is going to have a home in that style of deck. I don't really think that that style of deck is really going to be particularly powerful regardless, but I don't think that this is you know, something that's going to really find a place there. Next up, we have Fight Promoter. This is a kind of interesting card. It's important to note that this card will trigger if it is itself pumped. If, for instance, by some of the Grimy Goon cards that can pump cards in your hand, it will enable you to effectively play this kind of as a pre-nerf Ancient of Lore, able to play it and just reload by drawing 2 cards with a sizable body. I don't think this is really necessarily going to see play outside of that. It's, I think, a little too situational to try to play this after you've already played another big minion. That's just really a lot to ask, but I do think that if there are enough cards that you can use to buff cards in your hand to pretty much guarantee that the Fight Promoter gets big enough, that this could be a good way for those decks to reload. So whether this card ends up seeing play, I think it depends a lot on exactly how many hand buff type cards there are, and if there are decks that are able to utilize them very effectively. Next up, we have Hosen Healer. This is a card that obviously combines very well with Akanai Soul Priest. You can just go ahead and boom, blow up an opposing minion. It's interesting because it is a card that enables you to heal your minions and potentially even heal your minions quite a bit outside of Priest, which we haven't seen a lot of. You know, there is Earthen Ring Farseer, which sees a bit of play that can be used to heal your minions on the board, but most of that kind of healing, that style of healing, has generally been reserved for Priest. So I don't necessarily feel like this is a card that is super exciting if you're already playing Priest, simply because there are already a lot of potentially better options like Darkshire Alchemist. Obviously, the Earthen Ring Farseer is pretty effective, and if you're not getting a huge value out of the fact that this is a full health heal, you're not really maximizing this versus some of the perhaps more flexible options that can also heal your hero. So I don't really see that this having much of a home. I think that it's just kind of too inefficient in terms of what you're getting stat-wise for the body, unless you really are looking to combo it with something like Akanai Soul Priest. But again, I feel like the other options that are available are, in many cases, either cheaper or more flexible, and as a result, generally outshine this in that regard. Well, next up, we're going into Shaman. Let's start off with the Shaman Jade Golem cards. I think the most appealing of the Shaman Jade Golem cards is Jade Claws. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, it is just a reasonably efficient weapon. It's not nearly as potent as Spirit Claws is. You know, even though you're not guaranteed to get spell damage, you can get that very often, and the difference between 2 and 3 attack matters quite a bit in interacting with a lot of key minions like Alexstrasza's Champion or Voidwalker and things like that. But the fact that this does have the ability to generate a Jade Golem early in the game is pretty important, because I imagine that you're going to be looking to curve out with your Jade Golem generators in a lot of cases and be able to start that chain pretty quickly as early as turn 2 with the Jade Claws does seem like it can be pretty powerful, because every subsequent Jade Golem card you play is more powerful. So you want to get that chain rolling as soon as you can. This, I think, is much more akin to like a Stormforge Axe than it is to Spirit Claws, just in terms of the impact of it. Obviously, having both 2 attack as well as Overload make it more similar to that card. But I also think that, it's just not as high impact, because the fact that it doesn't go quite up to 3 does make it more difficult to kill some of those more important minions in the format. I do think that if there is a Jade Golem deck in Shaman, this is going to be a highlight of it, because I do feel like the early game interaction, as well as getting that sort of Jade Golem ball rolling quickly, is going to be pretty important for that archetype. So if that deck does exist, I think that this will see a significant amount of play, but if not, it'll certainly sit by the wayside. Next up, we have Jade Lightning. This is obviously another Jade Golem card. This one is a bit less efficient, I think, and a bit less attractive than the Jade Claws. It does do 4 damage, but for 4 mana, that's a pretty steep price. You compare that to, say, Lightning Bolt, and you're obviously going way up the curve to get the Jade Golem effect. You're doing a little bit more damage, obviously, but 4 damage is not really something that lines up terribly well with most minions at that sort of point in the curve. It's great to kill, say, a Totem Golem, and certainly it's excellent to kill an Azure Drake, but you're going to be generally facing off against minions that are a little bit bigger at that stage, and it isn't going to be really an effective removal spell for a lot of things that you might run into at that point in the curve. That said, the fact that it summons a Jade Golem means that it is, if there is a Jade Golem deck, very likely to see play, simply because having a critical mass of that kind of effect is very important. I don't think this is really the card that pulls you to play Jade Golem Shaman. I do think that's the Claws, but I think if you are playing that deck, this is a card you're going to include. Last up in the Jade Golem cards that have been revealed for Shaman is the Jade Chieftain, a 7-cost 5/5, certainly not a particularly attractive cost by itself, but it summons a Jade Golem, of course, and it gives it Taunt. Now this is perhaps a card that you do end up playing in your Jade Golem deck, simply because, like we've said, there's a lot of value to having that critical mass of Jade Golem effect. And it can also help buy you some time if you are, kind of playing those inefficient cards earlier, like the Jade Lightning. Getting a Jade Golem with Taunt can sort of help you get back into the game and play a defensive position, which can be, quite important at that stage. I am a little bit concerned that this is just, pretty inefficient unless you've already gotten a really big Jade Golem stack built up. If you get less than like a 4/4 or a 5/5 with this, it's certainly not that exciting, given that 7 is just a lot of mana. But the fact that it is spread across the 2 bodies does mean that it's resilient to removal, and obviously continuing to power through that Jade Golem effect can be important in that style of deck. So certainly not a card that I think is going to lead you to want to play a Jade Golem Shaman deck, but again, critical mass matters, and you'll probably play it if you're playing that deck. Next up, we have Murloc cards for Shaman in Call in the Finishers. And this is an interesting card because making 4 Murlocs for a single card is obviously very powerful with Murloc Warleader. Can obviously be very powerful if you're looking at Wild, perhaps, with the Sylphin Spirit Walker. And also goes very well with Every Fin is Awesome. The fact that it costs 4 and makes 4 Murlocs means it's essentially a free spell if you play it in the same turn as Every Fin is Awesome, which means you're getting a bunch of 3/3 Murlocs at a very, very low price, and that can be quite powerful. It'll be interesting to see if there are really enough tools to make sort of a Murloc deck that isn't just combo-oriented in the standard format. And if there is, I think that this is definitely going to be one of the key elements to it, because making a bunch of Murlocs for a single card really does leverage the powerful things about Murlocs that we've seen in the support cards like Every Fin is Awesome. So not a card that I think that is going to make a splash overall, but could definitely revitalize or perhaps just overall invigorate that Murloc Shaman Every Fin is Awesome deck. Sort of a Murloc themed art, at least, in Devolve. This is an interesting card. I don't think that we're going to see devolve in any sort of decks on a regular basis, simply because Shaman already has a lot of tools to deal with an individual big minion, like Hex, or a bunch of minions in the opposing side of the board, like Lightning Storm and Maelstrom Portal. If you do want ways to deal with minions that have death rattles or have other abilities to come back, like, say, Murlocs against Anything Can Happen, Devolve could be a powerful tool. If your opponent does play Anything Can Happen and you devolve their board and then clear it with a Maelstrom Portal or a Lightning Storm, that can prevent their Anything From Happen deck to work at all. So I think this can be a powerful card in particular circumstances where you care about those death rattles or death triggers, things like that. But I don't think that it's a card you're going to really see in high-level competitive play outside of those niche scenarios. All right, next up we have Jigna Water Speaker, which looks like it should be a Murloc, but apparently isn't. I'm kind of bummed because having sort of more stable Murlocs seems pretty appealing to me, but it is a very stable minion. 3/6 for 4. Obviously, the Overload gives it a little bit higher real cost than that. With a Battle Cry Restore 6 health, this is kind of like an antique healbot, but that actually has a significant body to fight for the board. So I think that this is a tool that could help enable more controlling styles of Shaman decks. You could even potentially see this in mid-range Shaman. We have seen Healing Wave showing up in some mid-range Shaman decks, sort of as a hedge against Freeze Mage or against, say, Face Hunter, to give them a little bit more tools to preserve their life total, which generally they don't have. But this could really throw a wrench in those aggressive deck or burn-oriented decks' plans, while also just being a totally reasonable minion against other decks. The fact that it can also restore health to your minions, assuming the text actually works that way. You can never really tell in Hearthstone sometimes. But this could be a way to keep your thing from below alive after killing your opponent's Totem Golem or Azure Drake or things like that, that can not only preserve your life, but also preserve your board state. And that's a very, very powerful effect. So this is definitely a very strong card that will see competitive play. It's just a matter of where it finds a home. Speaking of powerful cards, the Shaman Legendary White Eyes is one that can really just kind of slot into just about any deck. A 5-cost 5/5 taunt is reasonably powerful pretty much no matter what, but with the death rattle of Shuffle the Storm Guardian in your deck, and the Storm Guardian, as you can see here, is a 5-cost 10/10 taunt, and that's obviously just an incredibly meme-worthy stat line, even if we don't see 4-cost 7/7s really seeing much play these days. But White Eyes is a card that can definitely fit into pretty much any Shaman deck. Could be a sort of curved topper for an aggressive deck that can help protect your other minions. We do tend to see Shaman decks paying 0 for 5/5 taunts these days, so maybe it doesn't necessarily make its way into every deck, but it also definitely has the ability to help give some power to N'Zoth Shaman. We've seen some number of N'Zoth Shaman decks, especially those that are trying to really abuse Ancestral Spirit alongside Cairn, things like that. And those can use a little bit more help in terms of defensive options. We do see, say, Chillmaw in some of those decks, often without even any way to actually enable it. And White Eyes can definitely fill right into that role as a taunt with Death Rattle that is very effective with N'Zoth. So White Eyes, I think, is definitely a card we're going to see in competitive decks that may even help revitalize or even create some new archetypes that haven't really seen a lot of competitive play before. All right, moving into Rogue, we'll start with the Jade Swarmer, one of the Jade Golem cards for Rogue. This is kind of a weird card to evaluate. It's a 1/1 stealth minion with Death Rattle, summon a Jade Golem. And one thing that's important to keep in mind when you're evaluating any cards in Rogue is the fact that the Rogue hero power means you can do a little bit of incremental damage to help something like a Jade Swarmer kill an opposing 3/2 or 2/2 or whatever else. By itself, this is a 1/1 that makes a 1/1. And obviously that's not inherently powerful, but the fact that it can, along with the other Jade Golem cards, get that sort of Jade Golem chain rolling, I think is quite strong. This can enable you to start to generate Jade Golems very quickly, and especially alongside some of the other cards like Jade Shuriken, which we see here, can definitely get your pace of Jade Golem creation going a lot faster, it seems, than the other Jade Golem classes. You have a couple of cheap options with these two that can both fight for the board and give you the ability to help remove your opponent's minions while generate minions yourselves. And that's one of the most powerful things you can find in Hearthstone, is the ability to have cards that create tempo advantages by being removal plus a threat in themselves. And Jade Swarmer, not great at that, but Jade Shuriken, obviously if you're able to get the combo off and actually create your Jade Golem, can be very strong. And these two obviously work quite well in combination. You can use the Jade Swarmer and the Jade Shuriken together to kill, say, a 3 health minion or whatever, and that can generate you 2 Jade Golems and sort of really get that ball rolling in terms of making your Jade army. So I do think that these are both really attractive reasons to play Rogue in the Jade Golem category, and we'll have to see if there are any other options that the class has to help supplement them, because obviously, as we mentioned time and again, critical mass is just so important with the Jade Golem mechanic. Speaking of critical mass, Gadgetzan Ferryman is a card that has gotten a lot of kind of hate on social media, but I don't think it's really deserved. Obviously, this isn't a card that you're getting a unique effect out of. If you really want to bounce things to your hand, you have options like Youthful Brewmaster already. But the thing is that Youthful Brewmaster has slightly different stats, so obviously this can be relevant in sort of slightly different metagames or things that you might expect to see from your opponent in the early turns. I think Ferryman is generally going to be more effective, can stay alive through, say, Arcane Blast or Dagger or Backstab or whatever else a little bit more effectively than the Brewmaster can. It also doesn't require you to return a card to your hand. The fact that you can play the Ferryman when you already have a minion in play and you don't have to actually bounce something can, in some situations, be quite powerful or quite relevant because you're not triggering the combo. It can also be a little bit awkward because of the fact that it has combo means it has to be the second thing or later that you play in a turn. So, for instance, you might want to play, say, Reno Jackson, and the next turn you could Panda it, and then go about your turn however you want. With the Ferryman, you'd have to play something else first, and then use the Ferryman to return your Reno to your hand. So it could make it a little bit more awkward. That said, it's obviously, considering the exact card we were just talking about, Reno Jackson, the fact that you can have sort of a higher critical mass of cards that do the same sort of thing, you might want to have a deck that has Reno and 2 different types of Panda effects. So you can play the Gadgetzan Ferryman and the Pandaren Brewmaster and include both of them in your deck. You may want a deck that has a bunch of copies of Swashbuckler and this, and you can just keep recycling those and stealing all of your opponent's cards. There is also just a lot of things that have, combo or whatever else in Rogue that can take advantage of bouncing things to your hand. So I think that, the fact that there are comparable things to an existing card certainly doesn't mean that that card doesn't have a home or doesn't have any kind of purpose. I think that there's a lot of criticism in the Hearthstone community about that kind of thing that really goes over the top and is unwarranted. That said, I don't think this is likely to be a super powerful card for Rogue decks. I just want to showcase that the fact that there is, a home for something like this in terms of at least making interesting and quirky decks, and I'm sure I will play with the Ferryman in the future. The card that I'm actually kind of the most excited about, not in terms of what's available right now, but in terms of what it means for the design space of Rogue, is Shadow Sensei. It's interesting to see, a card in Rogue that cares about stealth, because it feels like Rogue should care about stealth, and we haven't really seen too much that really bolsters that mechanic in the faction. Right now, there's not that many stealth minions, so I don't think there's really a home for Shadow Sensei in a Rogue deck right now. There's like Jungle Panther that could be really powerful to pump with it, but not really that much else. If there were just a 3/3 stealth Rogue card for 3, that could be an interesting card that Shadow Sensei could pair with. It could be relatively powerful. It can pair with, say, Gilbin Stalker if you're playing Wild or whatever else. But if there are more stealth cards in the future, this is a card that could certainly find a home and could be, a cornerstone of a deck if the stealth mechanic gets a lot more support in future expansions. All right, the final class from the Jade Lotus gang is Druid, and let's talk about another Sensei. We just talked about the Stealth Sensei. Let's talk about the Beast Sensei, Vermin Sensei. This is a card that is kind of weird to me because it is a it's a 5-cost minion that is 4/5 and gives a Beast +2/2. On the surface, is actually potentially pretty strong because giving a Beast +2/2 is a pretty strong effect. 5 cost is maybe a little bit more expensive than I'd want to pay for something like that, but is totally reasonable. One of the big problems is this is a 5-cost card that wants to go in a beast deck that isn't itself a beast, and with Menagerie Warden at the top end for Beast Druid, you really, really want to be playing a beast on 5 like Stranglethorn Tiger to ensure that you have something to duplicate with Menagerie Warden. If Vermin Sensei were itself a beast, I think this card would be great, because I think that it would make it much more likely that you actually have a beast for your Warden on 6. You could potentially even copy the thing you buffed with it, or if that thing does die, you'd at least be able to copy the Sensei itself. Unfortunately, it's not a beast. It looks like it's a beast. It's a rabbit. It's like this floating rabbit doing, I don't know, carrot ninja stuff or whatever, but not a beast. So I'm a little bit down on the likelihood of this card really seeing competitive play, simply because the real capper of those decks is definitely going to be Menagerie Warden. It's just so powerful, and I can't imagine this gets the nod over, say, Stranglethorn Tiger, and even, you know, the Azure Drakes that you have in those decks. Azure Drake's a card that is good in those decks because it can give you the ability to catch up when you are behind, and, you know, you can play your Azure Drake and your Living Roots and you know, help clear your opponent's board, or Azure Drake Swipe, things like that, that, you know, if your deck isn't really firing in all cylinders, can still be powerful. But this requires that things are going right for you and you have a beast in play that's survived, and that could be more difficult to maximize. So I just don't really see this having a home in the best versions of those Beast Druid decks. Now we are ready to talk about the Jade Golem cards for Druid. Let's start with the simple one, which is the Jade Blossom. This is basically Wild Growth with a Jade Golem attached to it. First of all, I hate the fact that it is not clear if you get excess mana from this card, if you play it at 10 mana. You know, we've seen cards that do and don't give you excess mana when you play them at 10, that give you mana crystals when you play them at 10. You know, obviously Wild Growth gives you excess mana, Astral Communion gives you excess mana. But if you were to choose Mana Crystal with Mire Keeper, you don't. And part of the reason for that is that the other option for Mire Keeper is something that has an impact when you have 10 mana, so it's okay. But Jade Blossom does something other than give you mana at 10 mana. So it's not clear to me whether this will give you excess mana. And that's pretty annoying, because it feels like this should be something that you can tell from reading the card. All that sort of logistical stuff being said, this is a card that I think if you are playing a Jade Golem Druid deck, you want to play. I don't know if that's going to be a deck that is likely to be powerful. This is not really a card that seems amazing in those. Obviously, yes, if you're playing any Druid deck, in general, you're going to be pretty happy with ramp. This ramps from 3 to 5. Which is a lot different than ramping from 2 to 4, but it's a lot more difficult to give up your third turn to ramp, simply because you're more likely to have to react to more things your opponent might already have in play. So you do get a Jade Golem, and generally speaking, this Jade Golem will be a 1/1 Jade Golem, because there's not other, or at least many other cheap options that you can play in Druid to get Jade Golems prior to that. But you will, you know, get your ramp, and that's definitely very valuable. So if you are playing a Jade Golem deck in Druid, this will be in your deck. But it's not really a super exciting card in my mind in order to sort of push you in that direction. One thing that you can ramp to in your Jade Golem deck is Jade Behemoth. This is a 3/6 taunt for 6, which is certainly not exciting. You know, we compare this to like Fen Creeper, which was a 5-cost 3/6 taunt, doesn't see any play. So obviously the key here is the fact that it summons a Jade Golem with its battle cry. And as I've said time and time again, obviously this is something that you care very much about, because a critical mass of Jade Golem effects is really what it takes for these to be powerful. This, I think, is potentially, you know, if you are looking to make a ton of big Jade Golems, Druid seems to be the class that you're going to go to, and this is a card that can at least give you sort of a speed bump at a meaningful point in the curve, where you can try to defend yourself as you raise your Jade Golem army. So between the ramp of Jade Blossom and the defensive posture of Jade Behemoth, you have at least some tools to help support that basic strategy. So certainly a card that you'll play in the Jade Golem deck, but not one that you're really excited about. The card that most people are excited about for Druid Jade Golem is Jade Idol. Now, this is, in my opinion, the single least understood and most overrated card in all of Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. And what I mean by that is that people have like looked at this and like, oh my god, if a Druid plays this, you can never beat them with a control deck. And first of all, that's outrageous, because the way that control decks work in Hearthstone isn't always just kill all of your things and fatigue you. That is something that happens sometimes, particularly with Control Warrior. You literally remove every threat in their deck and you totally run out of cards and you lose. That happens. It certainly does happen. But that's not really the fundamental game plan, and certainly won't be the fundamental game plan of the way these decks are built once Jade Idol exists, if it sees basically any play. Even if it doesn't actually get put into decks, the fact that you can discover it with Raven Idol can very well mean that the just fatigue you completely plan is just off the table against Druids because they can just infinitely shuffle Jade Idols into their deck. But the thing is, that's not the way that so many of those games go, and it's not the way that they go if people build their deck with that in mind. You know, we saw control decks for the longest time, control warrior decks specifically, that would just play defense the entire game, then eventually Alexstrasza you, Grom you, kill you. And that was just their plan. And those decks used mostly the same cards. The reason that those decks maybe don't have Alexstrasza now, or even sometimes don't have Grom now, is because they don't have to. Because of the power of Justicar Trueheart, they can just armor up forever and then just eventually grind you out of threats. But it takes a very small deck building difference to just be able to kill your opponent, because now that's what you have to do. You know, those decks could have Grom, they could have N'Zoth, they can have whatever else that generally creates like an insurmountable board presence, or at least a very difficult board presence to deal with, that can kill you while you're sort of fidgeting and casting spells that don't actually do anything to impact the board. I think that people are really overrating Jade Idol as a tool to just beat control in a broad sense, because most of the time, at least when I win with control decks, it's because my opponent dies, not because they are totally out of cards like in their deck. If you play a Jade Idol and shuffle cards into your deck, unless you also have something like Auctioneer, you are significantly costing yourself in resources because you're playing a card that does nothing to actually impact the game right now. We saw this with like Gang Up, and obviously Gang Up is in a different class than Jade Idol, and that matters a lot in terms of the context where that sort of effect matters. But Gang Up was a card that people were like super excited about, were like, oh my god, this is so powerful, and then only ever really saw play in mill decks that were specifically looking to gang up Coldlight Oracle, and that was only because gang up Coldlight Oracle put more cards that could draw more cards into your deck. And that's just not true of Jade Idol, and I think the card is vastly overrated in terms of having that sort of inevitability against control. It gives you inevitability in the sense that you can't run out of cards, but you're still going to lose to their powerful things if they're able to, you know, actually get enough of their powerful things into play. And that's much more what the games tend to be about than just completely running your opponent's deck out of threats. So I do think that Jade Idol will be powerful in Jade Golem decks that are looking to make a bunch of big Jade Golems, because, well, you can make the biggest of all Jade Golems because you'll never run out of things that make Jade Golems. But it doesn't give you the same kind of inevitability in the sense that your opponent can't beat you once you get this going, because they could just still play Ragnaros and kill you with it. So anyway, that's my thoughts on all those cards. And yeah, we're going to see all of the cards coming from Mean Streets of Gadgetzan very soon, I'm sure. So let me know what your thoughts are on these cards and my thoughts and what you're most excited about. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.